before the morning fog could swallow the city streets, before the distant hum of traffic could drown out the silence of the sidewalk, a small voice broke the stillness with a promise that felt like a weight. "I promised not to tell, Mommy." Lumi's voice was a fragile thread in the cold air. "But if we go back to him, will you have to wear those dark glasses again?" Elara froze, her hand instinctively rising to the frame of the sunglasses that hid the violet-dark bruise beneath her left eye. 30 feet away, a figure emerged from the gray haze, a man whose presence carried a different kind of silence, a man who understood that some promises are chains. He had spent his life in the shadows of the powerful, but even he couldn't look away from a child's plea. The urban street corner sat in the heart of a district that had once been vibrant, now turned into something hollow and overcast. The concrete was cracked, and the iron street lamps were layered with years of peeling paint. A biting wind swept through the alleyways, carrying the scent of damp pavement and industrial exhaust. It was the kind of place designed for the invisible, where people walked with their chins tucked into their collars and their eyes fixed on the ground. Elara had chosen this spot because the fog was thickest here. She had learned that in this city, being a ghost was the only way to stay alive. At 34, her face was a map of exhaustion that no amount of rest could smooth away. It was the weary look of someone who had spent 5 years measuring the weight of her husband Marcus's footsteps, learning to breathe without making a sound so as not to shift the dangerous mood of a room. Beside her, Lumi sat with her shoulders hunched against the chill. She wore a jacket that had grown too small, her expressive eyes far older than her 9 years. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, tied by Elara's trembling fingers earlier that morning. No matter how much the world pressed against them, Elara made sure her daughter looked cared for, even as she herself counted the remaining crumpled bills in her pocket and fought the urge to crumble. The night they fled, she had taken only what would fit in a single bag, the emergency kit she'd hidden for months behind the winter coats. She had walked out while Marcus was still in a drunken stupor, his rage having finally crossed the line of no return in front of Lumi. Marcus Voss had spent years ensuring she had no friends, no family, and no voice. He had built a prison of isolation, but that night, Elara had finally stopped being a prisoner and started being a fugitive. Now, as the silhouette in the fog moved closer, Elara realized that running was only half the battle. The real fight would be finding the courage to finally tell the truth. The fog didn't just drift, it pulsed, a living shroud that turned the familiar geometry of the city into a labyrinth of gray-blue ghosts. Elara stayed crouched, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of her jacket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel Lumi's gaze, heavy, questioning, and filled with a terrifyingly adult concern. The child's words about the dark glasses still hung in the air, a confession of the secret they had both carried like a stone for 5 years. 30 feet away, the silhouette in the mist solidified. It wasn't the hurried gait of a commuter or the aimless wander of a stranger. It was a walk Elara knew in her marrow, deliberate, heavy, and possessing an ownership of the ground it covered. Marcus Voss didn't hunt, he simply reclaimed what he believed belonged to him. His tall, broad-shouldered frame cut through the haze, the dark wool of his overcoat absorbing the dim morning light. Elara's breath hitched, coming out in a jagged silver plume. She reached out, her hand trembling as she pulled Lumi closer, tucking the girl's head into the crook of her shoulder. "Don't look, baby," she whispered, her voice barely a vibration. "Just stay still, we're just part of the shadow." But Marcus was closer now. The sound of his boots on the damp concrete was rhythmic, a ticking clock counting down the seconds of their freedom. He stopped near a rusted street lamp, his head tilting slightly as he scanned the fog. Even through her tinted lenses, Elara could sense the predatory focus in his eyes, the stern, caught Shelburne, anus, beard-fringed jaw set in a line of cold frustration. He was the architecture of her nightmare, a man who had spent years removing the world from around her until there was nothing left but him and the violence he called love. Lumi whimpered, a small, involuntary sound that seemed to echo off the brick walls of the alley. Elara's grip tightened. Her mind raced through the heirloom of survival. The lies she would have to tell if he found them, the apologies she would have to make for running, the way she would have to tilt her head to hide the bruise that the sunglasses could no longer fully mask. The man in the overcoat turned his gaze toward their corner. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. The fog seemed to thin, stripping away their cover. The stakes were no longer just about a place to sleep or a meal to eat. It was about whether Lumi would grow up in the same cycle of silence, watching her mother disappear behind dark glass day after day. Elara closed her eyes, praying the mist would close back in, even as the heavy, threatening footsteps began to move toward them once more. As the shadow of Marcus loomed closer in the fog, the weight of the last 5 years pressed down on Elara, heavier than the freezing morning air. She remembered how the architecture of her prison hadn't been built with iron bars, but with whispers and subtle subtractions. Marcus was a master of the slow vanish. It had started with the phone calls, small, sharp comments about how her mother always sounded judgmental, or how her best friend was a bad influence on their family dynamic. One by one, the people who loved her were pruned away like dead leaves, until Elara was standing alone in a landscape where Marcus was the only son. He had moved them to the city under the guise of a fresh start, a promotion that required a quiet neighborhood far from the prying eyes of anyone who knew her maiden name. He had taken the car keys, for her safety, because the city traffic was too stressful, and he had managed the bank accounts because she was so much better at the creative things. By the time the first bruise appeared, Elara had realized she no longer had a map of the world outside his front door. He had turned her home into a fortress where every floorboard was a landmine and every silence was a trap. He didn't just control her body, he controlled the narrative of her life. He told her she was fragile, that the world was too dangerous for a woman of her condition, and that without him, she and Lumi would be nothing. She looked down at Lumi's small, pale hand resting on her knee. This was Marcus's greatest masterpiece of control, the promise not to tell. He had taught the child that their family was a secret kingdom, and that talking to outsiders was the ultimate betrayal. He had weaponized Lumi's love for her mother, making the girl believe that silence was the only thing keeping Elara safe from the accidents that happened when he got angry. The dark glasses Elara wore weren't just for hiding a black eye. They were the final wall of the architecture Marcus had built. Behind the tinted lenses, she could cry without him seeing her weakness. Behind them, she could look at her daughter and try to transmit the truth through her eyes because her lips were too afraid to move. But as the heavy rhythm of his boots grew louder, Elara realized that the walls were closing in. Marcus wasn't just coming to take them home. He was coming to reinforce the bars of a cage that was finally, desperately, starting to crack. The footsteps stopped just short of their shadow. A few yards away, the heavy silhouette of Marcus remained anchored in the mist, his head turning with the slow, mechanical precision of a hunter who knew his prey was cornered, but hadn't yet laid eyes on the kill. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elara felt Lumi's small body trembling against her side, a rhythmic shaking that mirrored her own frantic pulse. "I promised," Lumi whispered again, her voice cracking like dry glass. "I promised him, Mommy. If I tell, he said the bad things happen." Elara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, beyond the fog and the fear. She saw the way Lumi's lips were bloodless, the way her childhood was being crushed under the weight of a promise that was actually a threat. For 5 years, Elara had played the game. She had adjusted the sunglasses, applied the concealer, and perfected the art of the silent flinch. She had believed that her silence was the currency she could use to buy Lumi's safety. But as she watched her daughter wither in the cold, she realized she wasn't buying safety. She was merely financing their destruction. Something inside Elara didn't just crack this time, it shattered. The heirloom of survival, the instinct to hide, to lie, and to protect the monster, suddenly felt like a lead weight she was no longer willing to carry. From the corner of her eye, she noticed another movement. Not Marcus, but a second figure standing near a stone pillar, partially obscured by the shifting gray veil. It was the man who had been watching them, the one whose presence felt like a different kind of shadow, one that didn't consume, but guarded. He didn't move toward them with Marcus's predatory entitlement. He stood still, waiting, his eyes fixed on the scene with a gravity that suggested he was weighing the soul of the city. Elara reached up and did something she hadn't done in public for years. She slowly hooked her thumb under the frame of her dark glasses and pulled them away from her face. The cold morning air hit the raw, sensitive skin of her bruise. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked toward the stranger in the fog. "Lumi," Elara said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a steady, grounded sound that cut through the haze. The promises we made to him, they weren't real. They were just lies he told us to keep us quiet. She stood up, her slim frame shaking but upright. She took Lumi's hand and stepped out of the deepest shadow. She didn't run. She looked at the stranger, the man who understood the weight of a secret, and she nodded. It was a silent surrender to the truth, a final breaking of the vow that had kept them in the dark. She was done not telling. She was ready to be seen. The moment Elara stepped into the light, the predator's instinct in Marcus snapped into focus. Across the street, the broad-shouldered silhouette jerked upright, his head swiveling toward them with the speed of a shark catching a scent in the water. He didn't scream. Marcus never screamed. He simply began to move, a terrifyingly fast stride that ate the distance between them. "Run, Lumi," Elara breathed, her hand gripping the girl's small palm so hard it shook. They bolted. The urban morning became a blur of cold gray and sharp edges. Elara's boots slapped against the damp concrete, the sound echoing like a drumbeat against the brick walls. The fog was no longer a shield. It was a ghost they had to tear through. They lunged around a corner, the scent of industrial grease and stale rain stinging Elara's lungs. Behind them, the rhythmic, heavy thud of Marcus's footsteps didn't falter. He wasn't running with the desperation of a man losing something. He was running with the cold certainty of a man retrieving a misplaced tool. "This way," Elara hissed, pulling Lumi into a narrow service alley choked with overflowing dumpsters and rusted crates. Her breath came in ragged, burning hitches. Every shadow looked like him. Every steam vent hissing from the sidewalk sounded like his voice. They scrambled over a low iron gate, Lumi's small shoes scraping against the metal. Elara felt a sharp tug on her jacket as she cleared the fence, the terrifying sensation of being almost caught, but it was only a snag of wire. She glanced back. Marcus had reached the mouth of the alley. He didn't climb. He simply stood there, a dark monolith framed by the swirling mist, his eyes fixed on them with a chilling, quiet rage. He knew the geography of this city as well as he knew the geography of Elara's fear. Just as the panic began to paralyze her, a car door thudded open at the end of the block. The stranger from the fog, the man who had watched the truth unfold, was idling a black sedan near a subway entrance. He didn't wave or shout. He simply held the door open, his expression as unreadable and solid as stone. It was a gamble, trading one shadow for another. But as Marcus began to move again, scaling the gate with a fluid, terrifying strength, Elara realized that anything was better than the cage they had just escaped. She scooped Lumi up, her muscles screaming with the effort, and made a final, desperate dash. They dove into the backseat just as the car began to roll, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. As they sped away, Elara looked through the rear window. Marcus stood in the middle of the empty street, growing smaller in the mist, his dark overcoat billowing like a shroud. For the first time in 5 years, the distance between them wasn't measured in inches of silence, but in miles of road. The car slowed to a crawl as it entered a secure underground garage, the heavy concrete walls muting the roar of the city above. The stranger didn't speak as he led them toward a private elevator, his silence a stark contrast to the chaotic noise that had filled Elara's head for years. They ascended in a pressurized hum until the doors slid open to a hallway that smelled of lavender and floor wax, a scent that didn't carry the metallic tang of fear. He stopped at a door at the very end of the corridor, his hand steady as he pressed a keycard against the lock. The door swung open to a suite that felt like a sanctuary built of soft fabrics and warm, amber light. "This is a safe house," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The windows are reinforced. The building has private security. He doesn't have enough reach to touch this floor." Elara stepped inside, her legs finally giving way to the exhaustion she had been outrunning since she left Marcus's house. She sank onto the edge of a bed that felt impossibly soft, but she didn't close her eyes. She watched as Lumi wandered toward a small kitchenette, her eyes wide as she saw a bowl of fresh fruit on the counter. The child didn't ask if they could touch it. She just stood there, waiting for permission that usually came with a price. "It's okay, baby," Elara whispered, her voice thick. "Everything here is for us." Elara stood up and walked back to the heavy oak door. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she found the brass handle of the deadbolt. In Marcus's house, the locks had always been his. They were the tools he used to keep her in, to ensure she couldn't slip away while he slept. But here, the weight of the metal felt different. She turned the latch, and the sound it made was a deep, definitive thud. It wasn't just the sound of a door closing, it was the sound of a world being shut out. For the first time in 5 years, the silence wasn't a warning. It was a shield. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door and let out a breath she felt she had been holding since Lumi was born. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no rhythmic packing, no shadow growing under the doorframe. Behind her, she heard the soft sound of Lumi biting into an apple. Elara reached up and slowly, finally, pulled the dark glasses from her face, laying them on the side table. She didn't need them to hide anymore. In the safety of the Western Arms, the only thing the walls would witness tonight was the quiet, steady rhythm of two people finally learning how to breathe in the light. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the safe house, but for Elara, the light felt clinical and exposing. She sat across from a woman named Alina, a legal advocate whose eyes held the same quiet gravity as the man who had rescued them. On the table between them sat a recording device and a stack of blank forms, the physical ledger where 5 years of secrets were about to be tallied. "Start from the beginning," Alina said gently. "Not the first time he hit you. Start with the first time you felt you couldn't leave." Elara's hand went to her throat. It was harder than she thought. Telling the truth wasn't a relief, it was an excavation. She began to speak, her voice thin and hesitant, describing the slow erosion of her life. She talked about the night Marcus had smashed her phone because she'd stayed late at work, and the way he'd apologized the next morning with a bouquet of lilies that smelled like a funeral. She recounted the architecture of control, the way he'd mapped out her days until she needed his permission to breathe. Every time she reached a particularly dark memory, her hand would ghost toward the side table where her dark glasses lay. She felt naked without them, as if the bruise under her eye was a neon sign of her failure. "He told me no one would believe me," Elara whispered, her gaze fixed on the spinning reels of the recorder. "He said he was the one with the reputation, the one with the important friends. He said I was just a girl who couldn't keep her life together." As she spoke, the invisible weight that had hunched her shoulders for years began to transfer onto the paper. She documented the accidents, the fall down the stairs that wasn't a fall, the door that swung shut on her wrist, and finally, the night he had crossed the line in front of Lumi. Lumi was in the next room, drawing with a box of new crayons, but Elara could still feel the child's presence through the wall. She realized then that this documentation wasn't just a legal necessity, it was a bloodletting. For 5 years, Marcus had owned the story. He had written the narrative of her clumsiness and her fragility. By the time she finished, the sun had moved across the floor. Her voice was raspy and her chest ached, but the silence that followed wasn't the heavy, terrifying silence of Marcus's house. It was the quiet of an empty room after a storm. She looked at the dark glasses one last time and didn't pick them up. The pain was documented. The secret was out. The monster was no longer a ghost in her head. He was a series of facts on a page, and facts could be fought. While Elara was recording the truth in the quiet sanctuary of the safe house, the world outside was still vibrating with Marcus's fabrications. For days, he had utilized his influence like a scalpel, carving out a narrative of a mentally unstable mother who had kidnapped their daughter in a fit of delusion. He had filed police reports, triggered Amber Alert-style warnings among his high society contacts, and painted himself as the grieving, desperate father searching for a broken woman who didn't know what was best for her child. But the legal advocate, Alina, didn't move with the frantic energy of a lie. She moved with the heavy, unyielding momentum of a fact. By the following afternoon, the documentation Elara had provided was met with a digital counterstrike. Alina's team didn't just file paperwork, they dismantled Marcus's architecture of control brick by brick. They submitted the hospital records Elara had once been too afraid to claim, the time-stamped photos of the bruises she had hidden behind her dark glasses, and the sworn testimony of the man who had witnessed Marcus hunting them through the fog. In a sterile conference room uptown, the kidnapping narrative began to dissolve. The detective assigned to Marcus's report sat across from Alina, looking at the evidence that Marcus had spent 5 years ensuring would never see the light of day. He saw the mismatch between the fragile woman Marcus described and the systematic, calculated abuse the records proved. The false reports weren't just questioned, they were rescinded. The alert on Elara was quietly lifted, and the machinery of the law, which Marcus had so often used as a weapon, suddenly turned its cold, steel edge toward him. When Alina returned to the suite to deliver the news, Elara was sitting by the window, watching the city below. For the first time, she wasn't looking for a shadow in a dark overcoat. "The reports are gone, Elara," Alina said, her voice steady. "The system knows who he is now. He can't use the police to find you anymore. You aren't a fugitive, you're a witness." Elara felt a strange, light sensation in her chest, a phantom limb of fear finally falling away. Marcus's power had always relied on the darkness, on the promise not to tell, and the dark glasses that kept the world from seeing his work. But truth, once documented and spoken aloud, acted like a solvent. The lies he had told to the world were curling and blackening in the heat of the facts. He was no longer the influential victim. He was a man whose secrets had been dragged into the morning light, leaving him with nowhere left to hide his hands. The shift in the atmosphere didn't happen with a roar, but with a quiet, clinical precision. Marcus Voss sat in his expansive corner office, the late afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows across his mahogany desk. For years, this room had been his command center, the place from which he orchestrated his influence and maintained the illusion of a perfect life. But today, the heavy silence of the room was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic knock at the door, not the deferential tap of an assistant, but the authoritative strike of someone who didn't need permission to enter. 2 officers stood in the doorway, their expressions as unyielding as the granite exterior of the building. They didn't offer a greeting. Instead, one of them stepped forward and placed a thick envelope on the desk. "Marcus Voss, you've been served." Marcus didn't move. He looked at the envelope, his jaw tightening as he read the bold lettering of the temporary protective order. For the first time in his life, the architecture of control he had built was being used against him. The document didn't just command him to stay away from Elara and Lumi, it stripped him of his most powerful weapon, isolation. He realized, with a cold sinking in his gut, that he was no longer alone with his victim. The promise not to tell had been replaced by a network of eyes, lawyers, social workers, police, and the mysterious man in the overcoat who had pulled the curtain back on his secrets. The walls he had built to keep Elara in were now the same walls keeping him out. The legal system, which he had once navigated with arrogant ease, had created an invisible shield around his wife, a barrier that his wealth and reputation could not penetrate. He looked out the window at the city, but the streets no longer looked like his territory. They looked like a maze where he was being watched. He reached for his phone to call one of his important friends, but for the first time, he hesitated. The truth Elara had documented was now public record, a stain that wouldn't wash away with a favor or a bribe. Miles away in the quiet light of the safe house, Elara felt the change in the air. She didn't have to look at the clock to know the order had been served. The crushing weight of Marcus's presence, the feeling that he was always just behind her, watching from the fog, suddenly felt lighter. The shield was invisible, but it was solid. For 5 years, she had been a ghost in his house, but tonight, he was the one being pushed into the shadows. She looked at Lumi, who was playing peacefully on the rug, and for the first time, Elara didn't check the deadbolt twice. The world was finally standing between them and the man they had once been too afraid to name. The morning that Elara walked into her new apartment, the fog had finally lifted, replaced by a pale, insistent sun that made the city's glass towers gleam like polished silver. This wasn't a safe house or a temporary suite. It was a space with her name on the lease, a place where the air didn't taste of someone else's charity. It was modest, located on the 4th floor of a brick building with wide windows that looked out over a small courtyard where a few stubborn oak trees were beginning to bud. Lumi ran ahead, her sneakers squeaking on the fresh hardwood. She didn't head for a corner to hide or wait for a whispered command to stay still. Instead, she threw open the door to her own bedroom and laughed, a sound so bright and unburdened that Elara felt a physical ache in her chest. Elara stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by a few boxes that contained the fragments of their new life. She walked over to the small kitchen counter and set her bag down. Inside, tucked into a side pocket, were the dark tinted sunglasses. They were scratched now, the frames slightly bent from the run through the fog, the lenses smeared with the salt of a dozen different terrors. She took them out and held them in her palm. For 5 years, these had been her armor. They were the barrier she had used to survive Marcus's world, the heirloom of survival that had kept her secrets hidden and her daughter's fears at bay. They represented the promise not to tell and the long, cold nights of whispering in the dark. Elara looked at her reflection in the window. The bruise under her left eye had faded to a faint, yellowish smudge, a ghost of a shadow that was finally disappearing. She saw a woman with high cheekbones and a narrow face, but the eyes that sleep couldn't fix had changed. They were clear, grounded, and focused on the future. With a steady hand, Elara walked to the trash bin beneath the sink. She didn't hesitate. She didn't feel a sense of loss. She dropped the glasses inside and heard the hollow clink as they hit the bottom. She was done hiding. She was done seeing the world through a filter of fear. She walked over to the front door and reached for the lock. It was a sturdy, simple deadbolt. She turned it, and the sound it made was no longer a signal of a prison, but a promise of peace. It was a lock that she owned, a key that she held. "Mommy, look," Lumi called out, holding up a drawing she had started. It was a picture of a house with giant windows and a sun that took up half the sky. Elara knelt beside her, pulling the girl into a hug that smelled of fresh laundry and hope. She looked out the window at the clear, blue horizon. The architecture of control had been dismantled, the dark glass was gone, and for the first time in her life, Elara could see everything with perfect clarity. They were finally, truly home.